Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm a lecturer over in the Social Policy and Social Work Department, and I just want to take some time to share with you today about some writing strategies, some tools, some writing tips that I share with my students as I'm talking with them about figuring out some better ways, some less stressful ways of writing so that they get their assignments in on time and so that they get the best mark that they could hope for. I should say that most of these are things that I learnt from Lillian and I share with my students shamelessly as if I came up with them myself. One of the modules that I teach every year is the dissertation module for the Masters in Social Work students. By the end of this module, our social work students are expected to have written a 16,000 word dissertation. This obviously is the longest piece of writing that most of our students have ever done in the programme, in their academic lives, usually in their whole lives. And usually when I tell them how many words it is, they look at me like I'm absolutely crazy. They're intimidated by it. They are really quite worried about doing it. And so any tips or strategies that I can share with them, they're really quite eager to hear. But most writing tips and strategies are really quite useful for all different types of writing as well, for the shorter assignments that we are usually working with for our students, whether that's our first year undergraduates, where we're asking them to do much shorter pieces of writing in comparison to our graduate students. I should say as well that these tips are things that I share with my students because I find them really useful in my own writing as well. You know, part of our jobs as academics is to churn out our own writing. And I wouldn't recommend these things to my students if they weren't things that I found worked for me as well. So I've got 3 things that I want to share with you today. And I hope that you will find them useful as I have found them useful. So the first tool that I share with my students year after year without fail is mind mapping. So I'm sure you're probably familiar with the concept of mind mapping, of diagramming thoughts, beginning with a central idea and then spanning off into ideas that come from that central idea. It's a visual way of getting down ideas onto a piece of paper. This is something that I use every year at the beginning of the dissertation module, but which I also recommend to students in other modules. I recommend to students in supervision sessions, particularly students who are maybe struggling with figuring out what it is that they want to write about in the first place. You know, sometimes students come with lots and lots of different ideas or kind of with scattered thoughts, and they'll talk 9 to the dozen, but don't really have a central focus. And mind mapping can be a really, really useful tool of just getting them to sit down and calm down and to think a little bit more clearly about what they want to do. And again, I should emphasize, I speak about students like this because this is something that I do myself. When I'm feeling a little bit scatterbrained, I find it really useful to sit down and mind map myself. Mind mapping can also be really, really useful for a student who comes into a class, for example, a dissertation class, with a very clear idea of what they want to do, but maybe their idea is a little bit too narrow. They can be very, very stuck in a single idea, and sometimes that can be really unhelpful. And so mind mapping can actually help them to expand their ideas, to think off of a central idea and think, well, what about this? What about that? What about that links to that central idea? And so it can help them think, well, what if that? But mind mapping can also be useful later on in a project, not just at the beginning, but later on. Maybe when a student needs to flesh out an idea, maybe they've come up with a really great idea, but they've maybe come to a full stop. Maybe they've got themselves kind of tied into a corner and they need to think, where do I go from here? Or maybe they need to think, what are the ideas that fit within this particular chapter? Or what are the ideas that fit even in this particular paragraph? I love to use a mind map. Now, I am the sort of person that mind maps on the back of an envelope with any old pencil that I found on the floor. I mean, seriously, that's the way I mind map. But there are also lots of technological ways of mind mapping. There are online mind map tools and the digital mind map tools that I'm sure Lillian can tell you all about. So go use those fancy ways of doing it. But seriously, the back of an envelope works just fine for me as well. The second strategy or tip that I want to share with you today that I speak with my students about is just getting to know the structural tools that exist within whatever software they're using, whether it's Microsoft Word or whether it's Google Docs, and getting to know those things right at the beginning, and I can't emphasize that enough, right at the beginning, rather than halfway through a project, or as happens unfortunately too often 5 minutes before assignment is due in. A really good example of this, that again is something that Lillian has shared with my students, is getting to know the styles in the style settings and the titles in both Google Docs and in Word. So I always thought for the longest time that these things were just ways of making maybe your subheadings or making your titles look pretty. You know, in Word they came up in a really, really nice blue and maybe in a little bit of a bigger and a bolder font, and that was all that it was about. But I learned later on, and you were probably all way ahead of me in this, that actually by changing the style setting in your subtitles, in your various subheadings and so on, is a really good way of actually organising your document, which maybe if you're writing a 2-pager is not quite so important, but if you're working on a dissertation, if you're working on a thesis, or if you're working on a much longer project, it's really important. And I share this with students, particularly when they're working on dissertations, because of course they're going to want to produce things like contents, and this is so much easier to do if they've already used these style settings so that they can get their document organised from the beginning. But also doing this can help them organise their document so that it's much, much easier to move things around without doing so much, thinking about or moving pieces of paper around, which is obviously what we used to do in the old days. One of the things I'm forever trying to persuade students of is that we don't have to start writing a document from the introduction and then just work on from the beginning all the way through to the end, which again is something that probably seems really obvious to you, but maybe isn't quite so obvious to some of the younger students that we have coming through. Another message that I find myself giving students fairly often is that it's completely okay to write something and then realise it doesn't fit quite where I've put it. And so I need to move it to be part of another chapter or to be part of another section. And by getting used to the way that Word or Google Docs works, it can be a lot easier to do that. So begin right at the beginning, get used to the way that this software works. And the last tip or strategy that I want to share with you is more about the way that we actually get the words down on paper, or of course the way that we get the words on our screen. And again, of course, this is something that I learned from Lillian, though it's something that has been part of my life also for quite a long time. I don't know about you, but I get my best ideas in the most ridiculous places and the most inconvenient places. I think about writing all the time. I think about the projects I'm working on all the time. And when I'm working out a problem, when I'm thinking about how I'm going to say something, how I'm going to work in a theory into an article I'm writing, I get the answer when I'm walking home from work or something like that. And in the old days, I used to speak into a dictaphone. No, seriously, I used to do that. That's who I am. That's how old I am. I used to actually audio record what I was thinking, and then I used to transcribe it. Okay, I used to do that, sorry. But now, of course, we have technology that makes doing that sort of thing so much easier. We can use apps on our phones that will not only audio record what we're saying, but that will convert it to text for us as well. And of course, there are fantastic ways of speaking and having that converted to text that we can use within Word, within Google Docs as well. And that's another tip that I share with students quite frequently, and they love it. This can be really, really useful for students, maybe when they're in the situation that I've shared with you that I find myself frequently in, when they have a lot of ideas but they don't quite know how to get it down in writing. So they just want to speak out. They're maybe much more verbal than they are able to write. So I encourage them, hey, just speak it. Just blurt it out what you're thinking, just like you're saying it to me right now. Just say it. Get it down on a Word doc, a Google doc, and let the technology do the job of typing it out for you. Another time that this technology can be really useful for students is if they're maybe a little bit of a perfectionist in their writing, or they have a bit of inertia about getting going in writing, and maybe they sit there with their fingers on the keyboard and they just can't type out those first few words, but they maybe could speak out those first few words. And so I encourage them just to try it, just to see if they can maybe speak out those first few sentences. It doesn't work for everybody, and you know what? That's okay. And that's one thing I say with a lot of these things. If it doesn't work, it's fine. Don't use it. And the last thing I wanted to share with you was that I love to use, I think of it as maybe the reverse of the voice into text, is that I also love to use the facility that comes with a lot of accessibility suites in that both in Word and Google Docs, you can have your computer read out what you've written to you as well. I am forever telling students to read their work aloud to themselves. It is an excellent way of for all of us, not just students, but for us as well, of hearing our mistakes in our writing, hearing the flow of what we've written. We hear stuff that we don't see when we're reading writing. And so I, as I say, have always recommended students read stuff out loud. Go find an empty room and read it out loud. But recently, I've been using these accessibility features where we can get this tiny little robot voice to read our work out to us. And I have been actually getting my computer to read out my work to me. And I've been recommending this to students as well as just a way of hearing their work and just seeing if the flow works, if they've written a sentence that just doesn't make sense. And so that's my last recommendation about the way that we can use technology to help us in our writing. So I think that's it. I'm going to sign off.